My name is Heier. I'm from the Houston chapter. I've been involved in left organizing for several years, gotten more involved with party work in the last 2 years. That's thanks to development and attention from comrades near and dear to my heart. So shout out to my friend Niles, shout out to my friend Bernard. Great resources if anyone ever has questions or needs mentorship, especially in anything related to the party. Fantastic resources, don't waste them. So wanted to give a shout out there. As Jen mentioned, my topic today is going to be the democratic struggle. And this presentation is framed today, not so much as a lecture, because it's miserable to be lectured at, and it's even more miserable to be the lecturer, let me assure you. So I'm going to stay seated, and I would like the format to be more forum-like, right? So as we're going through the slides, Group 3 nailed that. It was so much more of a conversation that they ate up time in a way that was very respectable. So the stress is always can I fill my time slot? So respect. This time around, I'd like to kind of replicate that. So as something is interesting or as you have a comment, just to keep it ordered, pop your hand up and I'll try and get an eye on you, or someone can point you out to me or whatever. But let's keep it conversational as opposed to me just talking at the group, because that sucks for me. So when I was in college, I took this class called Technical Communications, or TechCom, the dreaded TechCom, and everyone hated it because it was this terrifying class where we had to talk in front of people. My mutant ability is I don't really have that fear, just because of things I do in my private life. And one of the things that really affected me from that class was this lesson that we were taught in the first week, which was the effective way to frame a presentation, give the presentation, and then review the presentation all in one sitting. And it's boiled down to tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, right? Sure, everyone's heard it before. So that's what I'm doing with this. So we have a table of contents here. I'm telling you what I'm going to tell you here. So let's just get into it. First, we're talking about the democratic struggle. I think the logical starting point, keystone of that, is wrapping our heads collectively around what the concept of democracy is and how we define that, how it's been defined classically and in the modern era, and how it applies in real people's lives and outside of a theory textbook. So that's step number one. Step number two, we're going to break down the reality of sham democracy. It's a term that I've used in this slideshow to represent the concept of what's called democracy and sold as democracy in capitalist nations like the United States. So that will be section 2. Section 3 will be the struggle for true workers' democracy, defining how that differs and how it's on the opposite side of the coin from a sham capitalist democracy, how it fulfills and satisfies the definitions in a way that fake or untrue or capitalist or bourgeois democracy does not. So that's section number 3. 4, real world applications. So what is to be done today? How do these lessons jump off of the page or out of the program and become applicable for us in real ways that matter and provide avenues of real praxis, as opposed to nice talking points? And as Bernard so eloquently put it earlier, if you're just showing up and you're talking at meetings and that's all you're doing, why are you here? Because the whole point of this is to sharpen one another and then take these lessons outside of these 4 walls and utilize them in ways that aid in the overall struggle, right? So section number 4, covering those bases. I'll get to a final conclusion, and then I am going to open it up again for sort of an open conversation. Alvaro, when he asked me to do this section, mentioned this is a divisive subject, and so you might have some folks who don't want to hear the things that are brought up in this presentation. That's fine. That's the time to do it. So at the end, we'll have a group discussion, airing of grievances, if you will, and we can hash out or go through each one of those as they come up. So without further ado, I told you, now I'm about to tell you. So section 1, goal is to wrap our heads around this concept called the democratic struggle, right? So we have to start at the beginning and wrap our heads around this, sort of nebulous textbook concept of democracy that seems to have multiple definitions depending on what country you're in, who you're asking, what governmental system is in place, blah, 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 blah. So in order to do this, I was thinking about the best way to accomplish this. And I came up with this approach, and I feel like it's simple and it boils it down in a way that's easily digestible. So these are three definitions of democracy. The first in sort of the, I'm colorblind. So in the lighter colored box at the top, the first is what I've called the literal definition. And it's literally exactly what the root words that make up democracy break down into. So literally rule by the people, derived from Greek. The first piece of the word demos, people, the second word kratos, rule. So that's the literal definition of democracy. Not super helpful, especially maybe among common discussion among common people. So let's move on to the second definition, which I've called the modern textbook definition. This is just straight out of the dictionary: a system of government by the whole population or all of the eligible members of a state. Important factor there. Typically through elected representatives. Okay, so we're getting there to something that sounds more useful for us or more digestible. Lastly, it's kind of like what I call like the Jimmy Fallon definition. You stop someone in the street and you ask them, hey, what is democracy? Like, can you define democracy? In my opinion, this is basically what most people, especially in the United States, would give you, which is a government in which power is exercised by the people, for the people, with free and fair elections. So those are sort of the three definitions that democracy has to satisfy. And if someone is claiming that they have a democratic system, if it doesn't satisfy these definitions in a real and meaningful way, then it's a sham democracy, right? So breaking into the first section, or I guess second section here, spoiler alert, if you couldn't tell by how I've harped on it already and the title of the section, we're going to talk about something that a lot of people in this country call democracy, but the reality is it really doesn't come close to the concept. So let's talk about the reality of sham democracy under capitalism and how it can be summarized and wholly debunked by understanding how our country's version of democracy can be described meaningfully for the folks in this room. So our country's always described in like the same tired sort of boilerplate ways. And we hear them so much that they become almost like common parlance, and they're burned into our brains from basically birth. One of the, and I understand this is wordy. If this becomes difficult to read, can someone let me know? Because I don't mind reading out. But yeah, I'll burn through those, no problem. But so one of these untruths, if you will, that is just basically stamped on our brains from basically elementary school on, is this concept of the United States is the most democratic country on earth, most democratic country on earth. We export democracy, blah, 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 right? So that is an outright lie, and it's intentional and pure propaganda. The truth of the matter is that what's known as US democracy, which, it's a misnomer, which we've established, but what's known as US democracy has always had an asterisk. And the reason I put it that way is that, when you're driving on the highway and you see like a billboard and it has this like seems too good to be true offer. And at the bottom, there's like this little tiny asterisk with a fine print that says like exclusions apply, blah, 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 blah. You see an ad on TV. Here's all these fantastic things. A tiny asterisk at the bottom with fine print, exclusions apply. So there's always been an asterisk just like that on United States democracy, literally from the very, very beginning. So at the very beginning, you have, voting rights in this country are established. And who were those first eligible voters? So white, property holding, Christian men, right? You have these four factors that allow you to participate in democracy, right? So enter the democratic struggle through various different avenues. The democratic struggle was successful through the years. And so you saw that whittled down just a little bit. So at first, white property holding Christian men, and there was the little asterisk on the side that said, only if you're the right religion, right? So while we still are, it's already so narrow, there is still an asterisk there. We're not messing around with people who aren't Protestants. So keep that in mind, or whatever. There was success in the democratic struggle. So it whittled down a little bit further, and it felt more broad moving forward. So, oh, how nice they eased it off to it just became from white property holding Christian men to just white Christian men. They eliminated the property holding piece. Okay, great. There's a little asterisk though, because, well, it's only if you fall into this strict line where you're allowed to, right? If you're indebted in certain ways, or you have, certain relationships with a landlord, or you're in servitude in some way, that doesn't count. You don't meet snuff, right? Enter the democratic struggle again. There's a little bit more success. It's moved forward. So then it's just moved to, all men, right? But the asterisk is still there because it's not all men, because if you're incarcerated or if you fall outside of what is considered, legal voting status, whether that's based on nationality, whether it's based on, prior criminal record, whatever it may be, still an asterisk. And then finally, more progress in the democratic struggle, and we got to legal adults. But there is still an asterisk. If you don't have the right process that you followed through your immigration process, you can't vote. If you're a felon, you can't vote. Insert tons of examples, but that asterisk has always been there. And so that's where we find ourselves today. And that's why I listed those bullets that Stephen pointed out here. Disenfranchisement runs rampant in the United States version of democracy. So obstacles in voter registration, especially for workers, especially for people of color, especially for young people, and especially for students. Strict limitations on polling place locations and hours by design. Gerrymandering runs rampant on both sides of the aisle. Voter roll purges, based on the same criteria listed above. And then last but certainly not least, the racist war on drugs that's resulted in mass incarceration has eliminated a huge swath of the voting population. So aside from disenfranchisement, the other factors that prove that most democratic country on earth is clearly not true is we have the involvement of corporate funding in elections, which drastically restricts democracy, the collaboration of two major parties that edge out and eliminate any possibility for any minor party participation, criminalization of protest, and simultaneous decriminalization of violence towards those protesters, which we've seen ramped up even in just the last 2 years. And then lastly, the restriction of democracy in the workplace with unending demonization and busting of unions across all industries. So I think those points soundly eliminate any kernel of truth of the most democratic country on earth, right? So what's another way that the country is typically described? Just like the last one, we're beaten over the head with this comment of this catchphrase that's supposedly describes democracy in this country as, freedom and liberty for all. Freedom and liberty for all. That's what we're all about. Oh, people, they're on a boat and they go past the Statue of Liberty and they know they've got freedom and liberty the minute they get here. Blah, 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 blah. It's this bullshit lie and propaganda story that's told to us from a very young age. Of course, not the truth. The truth is what's known as democracy, i.e. bourgeois democracy, is not and never has been true democracy. In reality, it's the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The workers have very little say over our economic and political lives. Market forces, rather, which are controlled by capitalists, driven by unending desire to gather wealth, have control over the lives of the populace. And what's called freedom under a bourgeois democracy is really the freedom to rot in poverty, the freedom to starve, the freedom to be overworked, and to be subjected to the interests of the ruling class. So Lenin said it best: freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in ancient Greek republics. Freedom for slave owners. And that really hasn't changed from the beginning of the country, where that was the asterisk, all the way till now. That's been a through line. So those points soundly, I think, defeat any kernel of truth that would be in freedom and liberty for all, right? So to tie this section all together, that was a lot of words, I understand, but in not so many words, I think what we've learned here is really, really simple. And it's what passes for democracy under a capitalist system does not, in fact, fulfill any of the definitions of democracy that we talked about at the beginning. And it, in fact, can be characterized by these three takeaways. And this is the most succinct way to describe capitalism, democracy under capitalism. not a system by the people for the people. It never has been. The elections are not free or fair, which we just went through. And it can be described by these 5 keywords that summarize it in just 5 simple bullets. It's restricted, it's disenfranchised, it's corporate driven, it has limited representation, and it's blatantly anti-worker, right? So now we've covered the doom and gloom side. Moving to the other side of the coin, let's take some time to examine what the exact opposite of sham democracy would look like. Let's jump into the struggle for true workers' democracy. So to start that examination, I like to go back to the source. Obviously, the 2 men that are the reason why we're here doing what we do, believing what we believe. So Marx said, democracy is the road to socialism. The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle for democracy. Pretty succinct, pretty easily digested, right? So let's add that to what Lenin said. All democracy consists in the proclamation and realization of rights, which under capitalism are realizable only to a very small degree and only relatively. But without the proclamation of these rights, without a struggle to introduce them now, immediately, without training the masses in the spirit of this struggle, socialism is impossible. So those 2 points combined, they make practical sense in a way that's easy to sum up, and they can be boiled down into like one single clean takeaway, is that without the democratic struggle, without fighting the battle for true democracy, socialism, and then through socialism, true freedom and true equality can't be reached. So what does that battle for true democracy, what does that struggle look like in a practical sense? So the struggle is multifaceted. So I included a lot of these icons really to mostly just to demonstrate that this is just a very small summary. There is a lot more facets that there's too many to include. And the reason for that is because each facet is a part of and enhances the democratic struggle. And in doing so, it advances the struggle for socialism. And as we all know and agree, ultimately socialism is necessary to permanently eliminate inequality. So just a few examples, the struggle for human rights. And we talked about that in section 3 at end. For every group, all working people. The struggle for a worker-controlled economy. The struggle for a free media and free internet, so on and so forth. These are all little pieces, and all these little pieces lead up, and their threads all intertwined to form this kind of larger rope, if you will, called the democratic struggle. That big picture is made up of all these smaller things. So what is the best way to get takeaways that are useful for the people in this room? So let's look to the party program and see if we can't, better understand that. It's boiled down into these 3 simple points. And you'll notice that the locks on this are the same 3 positions, same 3 locks, and they're open this time around. We've sort of opened the lock, if you will. First takeaway. All class and social struggles that seek to curb the power of the ruling class are democratic struggles. That's all there is to it. They're all part of the larger whole. The aim of this struggle is to advance equality in all forms, in all arenas, for all working people as much as possible. And lastly, class struggle and the democratic struggle are truly entwined. In both, the workers seek to expand and protect democratic rights for all. So those sum up sort of the, if one side was doom and gloom, the other side is sunshine and roses, right? But it's all still pretty dense theoretically, and I understand that. And it's a lot of text on these slides. I caught a lot of shit from a friend who's a professor that liked to coach me last night about that, and I was like, this is not super user friendly. I understand that. So yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So what that means, let's take this into and form this into something that's more useful for everyone in this room so that we have, real tangible takeaways. So we've been through what democracy is and what it is not. So what are the real world applications of what we're talking about here? And what can all of us do today? So let's jump into that. As we've learned, all other class and social struggles that come to mind are all parts of a larger whole that we call the democratic struggle. And by participating in those other struggles, building those connections with other orgs, other groups, other individuals from all across the spectrum of various struggles within class and social spheres, we are building alliances. We're working towards a common goal through a common struggle. That collaboration towards the common goal, it breeds strong ties with our allies. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to sort of display that at the very beginning. If you remember, I like, okay, it's awkward, but go up to someone that you don't know. Obviously, we're allies. We're here for the same reasons. We believe if not exactly the same things, very, very similar things. There's no reason for us to not know one another. There's no reason for us not to shake hands and take part in the struggle as a unified front, right? So as we build those strong ties with our allies, the result is that because of those strong ties with working people, labor with a capital L naturally becomes a key element in many of the organizations and electoral campaigns in the US today, which in turn results to a voting trend among union workers that's consistently more progressive than the general population. So it's funny how that works, is that when people have a goal and they share in the work to reach it, it results in everyone voting in the interest of that common goal. What an amazing phenomenon, right? So to get into the meat and potatoes of the slide is that the democratic struggle allies the working class with other social struggles and other elements of other classes, certain elements of other classes. The goal is common struggle against the capitalist class via those alliances. And as a result of those alliances, labor is the key element in many progressive organizations. Votes from those workers trend progressive, right? So it's because of that phenomenon that the democratic struggle is indeed a direct threat to the monopoly of power held by the capitalist class. And we in this room as communists must be at the head of that struggle, always pushing it forward. We lead the charge towards political and economic democracy and ultimately freedom and exploitation from exploitation and oppression for all. For those reasons, the extreme right works to limit the democratic struggle at every turn. And as communists, as workers, as progressives, and with all the other allies that we've already discussed in the slideshow, in the various struggles that make up that larger umbrella democratic struggle, we work to fight against the slide towards fascism in this country. And as we do so, so too do the attacks on that democratic struggle intensify from the people who would see us slide to the right. So this is really what it all boils down to, is that how can people in this room and people in our clubs, our respective districts, our party, aid in this struggle in the real world, in our everyday lives? The answer is super simple. Support all efforts to protect and expand the right to vote and guarantee democracy. So now I'm going to open it up to everyone on the floor. I said I wanted this to be a discussion. I've been 100% monopolizing the time, and I get that. So what does that look like? I'd like to hear some examples. So what are ways that we in the party can support all efforts to protect and expand the right to vote and promote and guarantee democracy? Yeah.
So thank you, Heier, for the presentation so far. Very engaging. I have some examples from the work that we did in the St. Louis chapter. I spent 10 years in that chapter. And we were involved in the democratic struggle in many ways. And I can highlight maybe one or two highly effective approaches that we applied in Missouri, which has some similar characteristics to Texas being a very conservative state and very racist state. So as I think Jen mentioned earlier, somebody mentioned that there are many comrades who sit in elected office, but they're in hiding, basically. They don't broadcast their comments. So that's a great way of getting a foot in the door, get comrades into these elected positions, Communist Plus, engaging the democratic struggle. That's a foothold. So I started my participation in Missouri with the context that there were a few communists in elected positions throughout the state. So we had a little bit of we expanded on that work by engaging directly with the most local elected officials in pretty much every dimension, all the way from school board to the Democratic neighborhood committees to the commissioners and committee people for the city, into state government. And we didn't require people to be communists or be members of the Communist Party, but we engaged them and involved them politically, culturally, and in the economic struggles where this intersection existed. Pretty much anywhere there was common ground, we engaged with them in principled ways, not sacrificing our values, not buying into the liberal approaches that they had completely, but finding that common ground. That did a couple things. One, it advanced the democratic struggle in just a practical sense. But two, it drew politicians very close to the party, and they began to culturally and maybe even not openly, but in many ways they began to identify with us. Philosophically, and as friends in practice. They were pretty much friends of the party, friends of the people's world is how they publicly associate.
I was going to mention the Friends of the People's World dinner, right? Is that something that you can tell folks about? Because that is it's like an exact example of what this presentation is about.
So we held all kinds of private and public events that engaged leaders in every aspect of the struggle, in many cases politically. One of them was an annual banquet, which was hosted by the People's World, so the people publicly associated with it. But two, we had all kinds of private events that we drew people into, and Bernard and Alvaro did a very good job of that in Houston as well. I think that's so. What the outcomes of this is that we had a group of very local and highly loyal Democratic apparatchiks who were associated with the party and were getting a little more comfortable by publicly associating with us because really it advantaged them because we had a tremendous political apparatus where we could make elections happen for people. We had workers on the ground who were highly disciplined and highly trained, and we were kind of like a strike force. If there's one board bill at the local commission, if there was a ballot initiative throughout Missouri, people knew you can talk to the Communist Party, and if you align yourselves with them, they can make the election fucking happen. And that, we flexing our muscles drew people even closer, closer. One of the outcomes of this is the totally silly but perennial victims of communism fund, where states and local governments love to posture and show, just do nothing but be proud of it by passing these local ordinances or statewide bills that commemorate the victims of communism. Well, guess who stood up for us? It was all of the Democrats that we had drawn into our organization who were public and said, we're not voting for this. And they got red-baited and they didn't care. And in many cases, they publicly stood up for our apparatus. They said, those folks, we ally with them because they care about education in Missouri. They care about workers in Missouri. They care about raising wages in Missouri. And that was because they saw us involved in all of these ballot initiatives to raise the minimum wage across the state, which we're deeply involved in, to fight our right to work, which the Communist Party in Missouri has been responsible for defending against right to work for 50 years straight. It's not the evaluation. So my point here is, in many cases, we find it anathema to engage with liberals or engage with elements of the bourgeois who, because we find it distasteful. But it is oftentimes extremely practical to draw them in onto our terms, build the relationship with these individuals, and then pinch them when it's time for them to vote in our favor. And you can build on that progress for further initiatives.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to build on what Niles said there, being from St. Louis, Missouri, my industry that I work in is water and sewer. And if you go online, you try to ask other plant operators, where's the best place in the country to be, a lot of them will say Missouri, because of the unions there that are protected by the fact that they don't have right to work laws. The Communist Party has been preventing for decades. And if we're going to talk about the democratic struggle, there's not only political democracy, but workplace democracy.
Exactly.
And so as a result, like I've read about what some of the sewer operators make there, they get good wages, they get pension, we get maybe a 401k in Texas. They have way better worker protections. Their overtime is, regulations are way better so that the bosses can't force them to work 80-hour weeks. And all of that is because of that economic democracy, which is then protected by that political democracy.
Which is common ground shared by CPUSA, shared by other progressive organizations, and by those unions. So by building those bridges and those collaborations, real change is achieved. Mary.
I was gonna say also intersectionality. Did I say that?
Yeah, yeah.
One time I said it, it sounded like.
Sounds perfect to me.
But I wasn't.
Yeah, yeah.
Intersectionality.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's something that I think that's, well, it's not
Absolutely.
easy, but I
Absolutely.
think it's important to relate to your comrade somehow, some way.
Yeah.
Because
Shared
I'm
struggle.
full of, like, white guys, that doesn't mean that I don't know your story, maybe you can. Background, I don't know, like, you can't always assume everyone has a story, and I think I like listening and reading biographies of like Gus Hall, a white guy, I mean, from other, people thinking, I mean, Marx, I don't know if it's totally right or not. Sure, but Lenin was, Marx had, he had like.
I didn't know him personally, but
Now, my point is that, I think that's important, everyone has a story. And, I like how we make sure the stories are heard, and even one of our older comrades, B. Lumpkin, I think she's like 100 and, I don't know, she's like living forever, but I mean, people have interviewed her and talk about the things she's seen. So I think one of the things I learned from, organization that some of us have worked with in public ed is letting the stories we've heard.
sure.
As people grow everywhere, letting the stories we heard everywhere, because we don't know, people's background. And I think that brings that intersectionality because there's enough funding
Absolutely.
everywhere.
That we have more in common
Yeah.
than what differentiates us.
Yeah.
Exactly. You had your hand up forever, so. Yeah.
I love everything. Maybe some can help on this question. It's more of a question about the process, and I'm still, maybe not just on how the process goes, but when it comes to down to a portal, where I stop is once it kind of hits the higher state level governors, right? Because that's where I'm wondering, like, where does it go once someone, we'll say if communists or socialists gets to that point that they actually fight hard enough and we back them up to get to that point, because like it or not, right? Bernie was technically politically assassinated, right? Like,
Sure.
in a way, it wasn't not like their head level, but on that level, we would be actualized. And now we have the progressive left squad, or whatever you call them, right? Who also tend to bourgeoisie politics. So my confusion is like, when it gets to that level, what do we have in play, or what theory has somebody already kind of looked at for that position? Anybody can.
So I have a partial response to that.
Sure.
So one, and this can kind of like tie back to Bernie as well. And obviously, Bernie is he's a centrist Democrat. But even that being said, Bernie's presence within the Democratic Party and his running for the presidential candidacy in and of itself was very powerful in exposing some of the hypocrisy within our two-party system to the broad populace. And so even though our own candidates and some of the people we work with may not particularly have a lot of power in whatever position they may be in, or sometimes they do, it's very important for exposing that kind of hypocrisy, as well as communicating that hypocrisy.
So you would say they could maybe, progressives could, when they get to that level, they're helping show the cracks in the system for people like ourselves.
Part to act, yeah.
So a good example of that exact same concept is you go back and look at, the candidates that the party has run for the presidency of the United States. you take a time machine back to those candidacies, there was no delusion at which point those candidates were ever thought to garner enough of the voting populace to truly win any election, right? That's not the point. The point is exposure in the same way of the hypocrisy of the system and the understanding that it is a possibility, it is an option, and that just because a party is a minority, it doesn't make the value of the represented lives in that party any less valuable.
It's a tool to raise class consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah, Steve.
Okay, so please stop. Yeah, feel like this question is irrelevant related to that field. Okay, I'm not gonna.
What, before a new question, did anyone have a response to that they wanted to get in before we move on? Okay. Go.
Okay. All right, so I'm trying to make it as short as possible. Virtually all my friends, all my family, and pretty much everybody I work with know that my politics leans toward the left. And I'm not shy about that. I'm not shy. I mean, I don't get into arguments and get to against it. They know that I'm not.
Sure.
And I don't have any problems talking about it. But I am very, very careful on who I tell and who I disclose that I am in the Communist Party, that I am strongly considering moving my ideology to a communist ideology because of the very unfair, very nasty smearing and justified smear and stigma going back to the 20s with, I think, Sconzo Vassetti trial that communists have, that the communists have in the United States. That we say the word communist outside of, I guess, these groups, just regular average Joe in the street, that his brain melts down. It's like he or she becomes closed-minded, doesn't hear his practice, is practically freaked out.
Sure.
And that's just the reality. I think it's a bad reality. That's right. What do you think we can do to kind of get rid of that stigma? Because I think we're kind of, if we can get rid of that stigma, we can go a lot further in accomplishing our goals.
So what I'm going to address it, and I think we have two answers here. So what we talked about earlier in allying ourselves with other organizations, other movements that have the common goal of seeing workers' lives improved and workers' lives better represented in a democratic way, whether it's economic democracy or political democracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But by building those bridges and showing, so when Micah goes to a refinery job and he's surrounded by right-wing, fringe right-wing people in Texas, and he advocates for unionization, he doesn't have to advocate for joining the Communist Party, but by advocating for the power of a union. And, you know, when Ajax goes to the sewer workers and is like, see how much better it is in Missouri? It'd be great if we had that here. Even simple actions like that push that small circle of people sitting around the water cooler further to the left. That's the answer to your question. That's the
point
plus.
where they say communist ideology is my ideology. How can that, you know?
Correct.
You have to say.
And even if it's not identical ideologies, it doesn't have to be. The goals are common. And that's the emphasizing point that I'm trying to get to. Rib, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, the other answer to this too, and of course, it's only for those people who look like me, right? Is
Sure.
that I will tell people at the drop of a hat. And the thing about that is that, like, yeah, a lot of people will shut down, but people's second reaction is often to go, well, how the fuck are you a communist? Like, explain that.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
And that opens the door for you. I've always been a blue collar guy, right? It's always been roofing, tree cutting, warehouse work. You know what I mean? So I work with people who you do not expect would respond positively to that. But for a certain segment of us, you know, if you could look somebody in the eye and say, hey, like, this is me, this is what I believe in, people are a lot more open than I think a lot of people realize. If you're straight up about.
And especially if you're already known, which I think you are, as a principled, reasonable, hardworking, well-rounded person. There's value there.
Expanding on what both of you have been saying, I think that I could best summarize this to being a living, breathing refutation of their preconceived notions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nice.
I think all these things are great responses. Thank you all. The major mechanism that we used in St. Louis was called entry formation, also known as the front. So the Communist Party chapter in Missouri, Kansas stood up a nonprofit public affairs education society, which was one step removed from the inner circle. Right, it was a front-facing public organization which had open membership. You could join, you could participate, and it didn't necessarily mean you're a member of the organization. And people who entered didn't necessarily know it was run by CPUSA either. They usually found out eventually. But it was a way to condition people at an organizational and community level to the practice of what we do in our culture, without necessarily using terms or ideological, pressure points, which may scare people away. So you have to treat each individual case as a specific circumstance.
Yes, yeah.
Some people will find it be very reactive to the terms. Some people will be very curious to the terms. But it's very useful to take an organizational or community-based approach to this. To stand up an organization up front, draw people into that so they feel safe and they can identify with it publicly. After they spend so much time working with you, learning from you, building relationships, known as building solidarity, then they're much more likely to hear what you actually have to say than ideologically.
Because they already agree.
I want to caution people about leading with ideology, because for many workers, the ideology is so far removed from their practical daily lives. They need their wages raised, they need better representation of workers. If we can build solidarity by aligning with these individuals, with average workers on matters that make sense to them and are necessary to them on a day-to-day basis, the ideology and affiliation politically happen afterwards.
Good.
Yeah, it's a matter about getting these people who sit on the fence, more or less. It's about being their material, right? Because if you don't know any better, if you live in a white supremacist fascist state like a lot of America is, you're just going to side, and you're not politically engaged, you're just going to side with whatever is cooking bread on your table and keeping a roof over your head. If you don't know an alternative exists, then you're most likely going to buy into that. So it's a matter of, yes, being careful about how front-facing we are openly, but this matter of being, showing people that, yeah, we're here, we're doing the work.
On material.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, also, yeah, then you hook them with the ideology after, what? They ask, why are you feeding my kid?
Right.
Why are you help, keep the energy, but why are you ensuring I get voting rights? And you go, well, let me tell you. And that's what it is. And thank you.
I can again only talk about my experience in Brazil. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
That's
good.
I've been doing for the last 10 years. But what you call new democracy, some we call new popular power, same thing.
Same thing.
concept.
Absolutely.
Just that's how we call it. That's how we talk about it. And three pillars we have for that in Brazil are first the struggle for good public education. That's number one. We have big presence in especially universities, but also especially universities that are really big recruiting grounds, but also in all these primary and secondary education teachers. So that's one of the big fronts for us. The second one is unions, of course. Unions, as we see, are the mechanism for popular power, for workers' power in Brazil. So we see that as we our primary focus. And the third one is something that I think here is kind of more, I say it's more broken down, which are Brazilian social movements. We have very big social movements that represent, they're not explicit communist, they're not explicit socialist, but they represent interests of large part of the population. We have systems for housing, for land, for all those things that have a national presence that and that are not run by the Communist Party, are not run by communists, are run by everyday people who are in that struggle for the last 20, 30, 40 years, but that have that sympathy for the party because we always show up.
With common goals.
When they need us,
Yeah.
we're there, when we need them, they know we count on them too.
Absolutely.
And so those are three things that we call beauty popular power. So and as to your you're talking about running candidates and all that. So we have class laws against communists in power in Brazil. They're not allowed there for other reasons. There are other mechanisms for that. But we always run candidates in the sense that we see it that way, that's a big propaganda move, that gets the word out there. And especially gets the policies out there. We have several policies in Brazil don't have to participate. 36 parties nowadays, 30. That are viable parties, I guess, to call them.
Yeah.
And
What a concept, right?
yeah, and then the Communist Party being there and being one of the few that's has stably been there with the same ideals.
Consistency.
Consistency. It has not, shifted drastically because of the 1990s or shifted drastically because of 2008. All of those things, they have the same ideals and they keep updating those ideals, but not getting out there. And that's something that really moves people because what they see is a bunch of parties to hire that are there to defend whatever is a
Special
today.
interest or
Yeah,
whatever.
and
Yeah,
then tomorrow we change it.
sure.
And so those are the main things that really create that in Brazil. And I think it's very it's not something exclusive.
Well, no, those are all great examples. That's exactly, I appreciate you sharing that because that's like exactly what I was hoping, those types of examples everyone would share. Mike?
Yeah, I guess that's similar to the question I was trying to answer with what is to be done literally today is we're all here from all over the state. We give each other's numbers based off of our working groups. If you're in labor, you need to get my number. If you're in public education, you need Mary's number. If you're in housing, you need to get each other's numbers.
Coalition building.
Yeah.
Yeah, between clubs, even though we're all the same party, that we need to be as connected as possible. Albert?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, the question you were asking, Stephen, that is anti-communist. Sometimes we forget, what is the purpose of anti-communism? It's not just to attack communists. Actually, it's not, that's not the aim of it. The aim is to isolate us from other working people.
Suppress workers,
They
correct,
don't want the communists to be involved with other people, especially the unions.
correct.
They deliberately passed legislation to keep us out of union leadership. That hardly act, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, in the state of Texas, they say we communists cannot run candidates. It's illegal. So all these restrictions, right? That not only are there restrictions on all working people, there's a lot more restrictions on communists.
Absolutely.
Isolators, working people. So what we have to do is we cannot allow them to contain us. We have to figure out a way to be involved with working people. For instance, I was involved very recently with the political leader of the union movement in Houston to raise support and support the organization of Starbucks workers
Sure.
and build alliances there. And we also were working very closely with the union to elect a pro-union person.
Yeah.
We were not successful this first time, but they knew they could rely on us to do that.
But that is the struggle. Is exactly what we're talking about here.
Elected pro-union people.
It's the same thing with the involvement with the party in Amazon.
They have candidates in public office, even though the law doesn't allow us to do so. We have to skirt around, allow those restrictions and find innovative ways to do it anyway.
Absolutely.
We still have to do it because otherwise they'll contain us. We're not allowed them to contain us.
What is state law?
Right. Let's make this the last one.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback up what Alvaro said, because one of the incredible things about the attitude of our party versus other so-called left-wing organizations in this country is that we aren't interested in isolating ourselves. The democratic struggle, as we call it, is really what Alvaro is talking about. We can't be contained. If there is a fight, we are in it. If you look at the tendency of other organizations that call themselves left-wing in this country, they pride themselves about being exclusive.
Yeah.
They pride themselves about being isolated. They pride themselves about being insular. They're interested in marginalizing themselves. In fact, if you're not marginal, if you're involved in other struggles, if you're involved in democratic politics, then you're not good enough.
You're not legitimate.
We cannot afford to have that mentality in this party. If there's a fight, we have to be in.
And I know I already saying your praises at the beginning of this, but I think a perfect example of that that's sitting in this room is our friend Bernard, who I've been at social functions that were, you know, pseudo-political or maybe had involvement with people who might be involved in music and they might be involved in local arts and they might be involved in education. And they all came together for a birthday party. And who rolls through the door? I'm like, look who it is. And passing around little invitations. You should come to a movie night. You should, you know, come to this event. You should come to this, that, or the other. And it can be as simple as that. And he's very good at that. So these are all awesome examples. I'm already going over my time, so I'm going to make it very quick. So I appreciate you all learning from each other and letting everyone, you know, have a little bit of the floor. It's exactly what I was hoping for. Because I was hoping to not have to go through this long list of examples as punishment for if no one gave their examples. I was going to go through a really brutal couple of slides of these long examples, but these slides are going to be uploaded and everyone will have access to them. These are great examples. I'm not crapping on them. I'm just giving them a short amount of time because I think it's more valuable to get input from the audience in a real way.